If you're doing glute bridges to strengthen up your hips, but all you do is feel it in your back, or it's stiff, it's tight, it's pinching, here's why it's crushing your results and what to actually do instead. What's up guys, Dr. Nick Bonforte back here to go over a classic exercise that you see all over. You probably do it, the glute bridge. It's a great exercise for glute strengthening. However, a lot of times I hear that individuals feel their back working. It feels like a pinching sensation. It feels tight. You feel the majority of your back working. Now there's many layers to this and reasons why. In this video, we're gonna focus on how a mobility restriction can actually be contributing to this issue and things to do to actually solve that problem. So from a mobility perspective, we have to consider the movement of the exercise. So when we go into a glute bridge, our pelvis is posterior pelvic tilting. It's rocking backwards and the hip is moving into hip extension, relatively speaking, versus going into hip flexion. You're in a flexed position on your back and you go up into a bridge. Your hip is moving into hip extension. Now, when we go into that position, what is being stretched? The opposite side of the joint. So that's where our hip flexors live. Now, the hip flexors, there's different components to it. Some attach on the pelvis, some to the actual lumbar spine, and they come into the actual femur bone. Now, when all of this is stiff and tight, it takes the pelvis and pushes it forward into an anterior pelvic tilt. When it does that, it already predisposes the back to a little bit of extension, okay? So when you're dealing with stiff and tight hip flexors and you go into a glute bridge, when you go into a glute bridge, you're moving the pelvis from that stiff tightness of an anterior pelvic tilt into a posterior pelvic tilt. So now taking into consideration when we go into a glute bridge, if we have all stiffness and tightness to the hip flexors, when we move into going into hip extension, the tight hip flexors are being stretched. If it doesn't have the extensibility to be stretched, we have to move from somewhere when we go up into the bridge. That somewhere is the low back. So our hips are gonna be stiff and tight because we can't move into hip extension. So we'll just start arching and compensating and moving through the low back. So you'll get that pinching sensation, or you'll feel like your back is actually working more than your glutes and your hips because you're just moving from where you got the motion. So localized, we have to address it at the hip flexors, and then also take in consideration the movement of how far you're actually going into the motion to get more effectiveness out of this whole movement. Starting localized at the actual hip flexors. Now we're gonna get in this classic one, but a lot of times this classic half kneeling hip flexor stretch is done wrong too, because we're in this stretch. Many people just try to dive in and get deeper into the stretch and feel it more, but they're compensating. If you lack hip flexor mobility and you just arch like this, you're just arching your back. It's not stretching it as effective as it can be. The idea is attention to detail and keeping it simple. There is complexity in simplicity. When it's done right, you gotta do the basics right. So when you're in this position and you're on one knee, before you just dive into it and go further in, figure out your starting point. Get your hand on your back and feel if there's an arch in your back. If there is, you're probably already too advanced into the position. So take yourself out of the arch. From here, tuck your tail. Really try to just tuck your tail, and that will tilt the pelvis into a posterior pelvic tilt. By just doing that, have a good mind-body connection to that, that should feel a stretch here when it's done right. So you tuck your tail, you stay stiff in your abs, and you stay stiff in your glutes. Now from here, me specifically, I already feel an actual pretty good stretch right here because good mind-body connection. Now from here to advance it, I can go a little bit further into it, and right there, I feel a massive stretch. Now from here, time under tension is your friend. By holding a stretch for 10 seconds and then coming out of it, 10 seconds coming out of it, there's no input. We need to get at least 2 minutes of time under tension to actually get some input to create change. We could also build isometrics into this position too. But first, we're just gonna posterior pelvic tilt, tuck the tail, stay stiff in the abs, stay stiff in the glutes. Now from here, I just advance myself forward and I feel a stretch. Notice how I'm not just arching from my back, I'm holding this position for say 30 seconds. After 30 seconds, I come out of it, and then I'm gonna repeat it again for another 30 seconds. You could do about 4 rounds. That totality brings us into 2 minutes. That's one option. Another option, you can just hold this stretch for 2 minutes in total, and then come back out of it. And while you're in this stretch position, we can build isometrics where if I'm holding this stretch like this, I can then start to push my foot down through the ground where I'm building an isometric. So I'm kicking my foot through the ground, thinking of making a hole in the ground. You'll feel your quad working. You could hold that isometric contraction for a bit of time, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and then after that, you relax and you move further into the stretch, and you could do cycles like that to accumulate 2 minutes of total time being stretched, and you can add those contract relax components into it so that you can go further and further into the stretch. Because when you add those contract relax components into it, the muscle builds up tension and it has some reflexive responses to then relax it a little bit further so that you can go deeper and deeper into the stretch and be more biased and effective to the area you're going into. That's more effective in terms of actually addressing the hip flexors versus just diving into the stretch like this and really just arching from the back and not getting effectiveness throughout it. Now, after we stretch it out, we want to work into available ranges of motion. Now, the idea with this, like I said in the beginning, when we're doing glute bridges, if we lack hip mobility, we're going to just be going up and just arching from the back, and that's why we feel it all in the back. So you want to work into the range of motion, even if it's not as high as some people might look when they do it. So from here, imagine you just stretch out your hip flexors from the first exercise. Now from here, you want to start on a bench where you can get your hips below your upper body. Now from here, I'm going to tuck my pelvis into a posterior pelvic tilt. So I'm tucking my tail. Then from here, I'm going to just move up and drive through my heels, maintaining that tilt until I start to feel a stretch going on in my quads. Once I feel like that stretch is happening in my quads, maybe in my hip flexors right here, that's where I'll stop. You'll notice that there's a little bit of a sag going on in my body, which is totally fine to begin with as you're working through these phases, because this is more effective at targeting the glutes and working the glutes during a glute bridge versus just getting up higher and arching from my back like so. So is it ideal to stay in this sagged position for the rest of your life? Of course not. You want to be working on getting your mobility better so that you can go higher and higher and get more effectiveness to it. But this is a good starting point. So you tuck your tail, you stay stiff in the abs, you drive up using your glutes, you stop right when you feel your quads being stretched, because then you know you're tensioning all of that front line hip flexor tissue stuff that limits this motion and not defaulting into extension. You hold this, I like to get time under tension here, 5 seconds, and then you come back down. And then you repeat, tuck, go up, stop right when you start to feel that stretch, hold, 5 seconds, and then you come down. And with this, you're repeating, say, 3 sets, 15, 10 to 15, so you get more time under tension. But the concept is to stretch the hip flexors and then activate into that new range to teach the body how to improve that actual motion and also flexibility of working into the range. Now, the idea with this, again, is not to just compensate and default into extension. So as you're going up, you want to be mindful of trying to get a good contraction in your pelvis and your glutes versus trying to get just higher up and arching from the back, because we're trying to avoid the pinching or the discomfort or the back working throughout this. This is more effective to get the glutes working of this exercise than just defaulting into that. Performing those two exercises can play a huge role in actually making your bridge exercise more effective. From this video, we focused on a mobility standpoint and a movement pattern standpoint throughout this exercise, but it's more effective in actually addressing the glutes and the strength that you're trying to get through a glute bridge versus defaulting and compensating and feeling more of your back working or that pain or that pinching sensation. So the concept here was focusing on addressing your hip flexor mobility, getting it opened and less stiff, more flexible, and then right after that you work into the new range of motion within your limits by tilting the pelvis, focusing on that tilt and focusing on the range of motion you're moving into without defaulting into back extension. You do this repeatedly and you'll start to see results. Is this you do it for a week and you feel like the world is completely different and you're much better? Of course not. You have to do this consistently. A bare minimum I recommend is do this for a good 6 to 8 weeks. You do this 3 to 4 times a week, you'll start to feel like your hip flexors are actually opening up, like you're actually moving into a bridge a lot better, like your back's not hurting as much, pinching as much when you do it, but you gotta stay consistent. That is the name of the game, consistency to the basics and being more mindful of how you're actually moving throughout exercises. I hope this video gave you some insight and value and understand more about the nuances when it comes to human movement, and we can't just be going through motions without any mind-body connection. If you did find value in this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you subscribe down to my channel down below, like this video, and leave any comments down in this comment section, and I'll get back to them. And if you really did find value in this, then I will see you on the next video.